So I want you to think back, way back, even before GPS was in our pockets, even before we had printed directions from MapQuest, back to maps, like real maps, like paper fold-out maps. In that day, you either had a navigator in the car with you or you just wandered around till you found your way. Well, in today's message, we're talking about something you may think you have mapped out, something you've got a handle on. It's about how Jesus charted the way for us when it comes to our generosity. Now, don't hit the off button. Stick with me for a few minutes because we're going to get some direction from Jesus about something that's a challenge for all of us. Messages about generosity are the easiest ones for me just to avoid because they're the easiest ones for you to misunderstand. Because when it comes to our generosity, here's the fact. We all need directions. Jesus talked about it a lot, actually. And in this series, Different, we find Jesus again challenging us to think differently. And this time that challenge is about our generosity, the giving of our finances. The way people who follow Jesus view their finances should be different than the way those who don't follow Jesus view their finances. So here's something we have to realize when we talk about generosity. Before we ever consider giving, we have to consider that God doesn't need our money. He's not wondering if he's going to be able to make ends meet with the money you give. He even tells us this in the book of Psalms. Listen to this from Psalm 50. I have no need of a bull from your stall or of goats from your pens. For every animal of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird in the mountains, and the insects in the fields are mine. That's God saying, I don't need anything from you. God doesn't need it, but we do. Because generosity changes the heart of the giver, and it moves the heart of God. It's like when your kids buy you a present, and unless they have a job, and most 8-year-olds don't, they're getting you a present with the money you gave them. Some of the most memorable and valuable gifts I've ever received from my girls were when they were younger, when I'd given them the money to go get me a gift. And because I gave them the money and they gave me a gift back with the money they used that was mine in the first place, it was no less special to me because it was from them. That's how God sees us. He blesses us with the finances we have, then we give back to the one who owns it all, and it moves his heart. Because our giving to God essentially represents our trust in God. Now let's jump into the book of Mark and see the different way that Jesus talks about generosity. We're up to Mark chapter 12, and I'm going to read the last few verses of that chapter, starting at verse 41. It says, Jesus sat down at the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. So here's what's going on. They're at the temple, and it was offering time. They would have all been seated in sort of a square that was open on one end, and they didn't just pass around the offering. It was right there at the front of the group where everybody could see when you went up and put your offering in. You would go up and put your gift in, and then you would go back and sit down in your seat. And in this room, there was Jesus, his disciples, rich people, and remember, rich is defined as having more than you need, and there was poor people. Because of its high visibility, the act of giving probably became something to kind of brag about, make a spectacle out of. Some would even blow a trumpet to get everybody's attention before they put their money in, so everybody would look to see how big their gift was. Today, we give differently than that. If you give online, it would be like posting on social media what you just gave, or if you drop something in the basket, you're holding your phone up and taking a selfie as you drop your gift in so everybody could see the amount. That's kind of how it was in that day. Can you imagine Jesus sitting here watching you give? Sitting in the spot where he can see what you put in. And that day, person after person, they come up and they drop in their big gifts. And then this poor widow comes up and she drops in 2 coins. Cling, cling. And it gets Jesus' attention. As Jesus sits there, here's what he sees. He first sees rich people dropping in large amounts of money. Now, he doesn't downplay what they've done, but they're not the focus of the story. Then he sees this elderly, widowed lady, and she throws in 2 copper coins. Monetarily, her gift was worthless, and it's doubtful that anyone even saw, but Jesus did. And in this one moment, he brings to us a different way to think about giving. These 2 copper coins, they were the smallest of all currency in Israel. We could compare them to our pennies. It was so small, the Romans didn't even have an equivalent to it. What difference would 2 pennies make? None. So no one but Jesus even noticed. He had to point it out to the disciples. It's like he's saying, hey guys, you didn't see this, but I did. And then he says this in verse 43. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all that she had to live on. Now, what a contrast. The biggest gift that day was the gift of the lowest amount that day. And now Jesus is giving us a roadmap for generosity. The biggest gift was the lowest amount. The smallest gift was the largest amount. And that is a different way of thinking when it comes to generosity. Now, likely in this setting, the disciples were really confused, thinking, Jesus, you're wrong. I saw a guy drop in $1,000, or look at that guy over there. He dropped in $10,000. And Jesus says, no, this widow, she gave more than they did. How is that possible? It's possible because her gift demonstrated more trust in God than the others did. Now, they would have likely been tithing, the rich people. They were giving 10% of their income to the temple, and she obviously gave more because Jesus said that she gave everything she had. So here's the different way of thinking. Generosity towards God demonstrates trust in God. If we look at amounts, this widow hardly gave anything. But if we look at the percentage of what she actually had, she gave everything. She gave more than all the large dollar amounts. So there were 2 categories that day. Those that gave sacrificially and those that gave out of what was extra. One gave out of wealth and the other gave out of poverty. And Jesus noticed the heart behind what the widow gave. This is really a story about priorities. So here's our challenge as givers. How do we give in such a way that demonstrates our priorities? If we don't prioritize, giving sacrificially is always going to seem foreign to us. I mean, think about how priorities work. If you have a family and you don't prioritize them, your family life is going to suffer. Some of the first things you can do when there's conflict at home is to sit down and talk about your priorities. How are you spending your time? And when it came to her generosity, the poor widow's gifts to God came first. You know, when Sin and I started doing prioritized giving years ago, it changed our financial lives. And it brought blessings that I don't think we would have enjoyed otherwise. And that's what this woman did that day. She prioritized. And the others, while they did give large amounts, Jesus says it was just out of what they had left over. That's why you can't put a dollar amount on generosity. You may have a lot of zeros at the end of your gift, and it would be very much appreciated and used to help people connect with God. Only you and God know if you're just throwing in what's extra or if you're truly prioritizing your giving. Here's how most people handle their money. You get your paycheck, and the first thing you'll notice is your uncle is taking money away from you. Uncle Sam always gets his first. Whether you like it or not, the government gets theirs first. But most is left for you to spend. And here's how the average family does it. Now, the first place we spend is on us. Second place is on debt, which is actually paying off what we spent on us when we didn't have the money to buy the thing we wanted to buy. And some people, they even try to save a little for the future. Then it's time to see what we have extra. And if there's any left, well, let's give that to God. That's how most people do it. And as we get more and more money in life, and we enjoy more prosperity, generosity actually tends to go down. Here's something that hasn't changed since the day at the temple when Jesus noticed the widow giving out of her poverty. The ones on the lower side of income give a higher percentage than those on the higher end. In other words, stats tell us that as income goes up, the percentage and priority of giving goes down. Now, I think it's because when you're on the lower end of income, at the poverty level, you have to learn to trust in God, to trust in others for help and to take care of you. And we get at the upper end, you're a little more self-sufficient and not as much trust is required. So here's what I've discovered from my personal experience. It's easy to get off track with our generosity. So easy. But when you can get back on track and give in a way that demonstrates trust, you will live the life that God has for you. Remember, all the money's God's anyway. So giving back to Him is not because He needs it, but because our hearts need it. How do you get there? Can we all get to a place where our gift to God is the first thing and not the last thing, not the leftovers? I think we can. Here's how. It starts with evaluating our financial priorities. Try it for the next couple of months. Give back to God first through your local church. Give before the bills, before the mortgage, before the savings account. Give to Him first. Now, next is deciding how much you're going to give. You want to give like the widow, or do you want to give like the rich people that day? Start with a percentage. But don't start with the percentage you think you can afford. Start with the percentage that you're going to feel. That's called sacrifice. I think God's desire for His people to give a percentage is intentional. And God decided that percentage was 10%. Jesus reinforced it. So I would say it's a great place to start. And you might think, well, that's uncomfortable. Well, so is a root canal, but you're going to be better off afterwards. Just start. Some of you already do what I just said. You've prioritized your giving. You give 1% every month to support the mission at Lifepointe of helping people connect with God. Thank you. Because of your generosity, big things have happened. People have been served and lives have been changed. Here's my challenge to you. First, let me tell you a story. One time, a person who gave a lot of money to our church took me out to lunch to tell me that he could no longer tithe. And I was concerned for a moment. And then he said, what I mean is I can no longer just tithe. See, he had tithed for years, and God had blessed him with a lot of money. And he said this to me that day, Donnie, my gift might be a larger dollar amount, but I don't even feel that anymore. I make so much money that 10% is so easy, I don't feel it. So I want to start giving more so I can feel like I did when we first started giving. And my response was, I think that's a great idea. What he was describing was what Jesus said about the rich that day as he compared the widow and them. When Jesus said the wealthy just gave out of what was extra. And my friend no longer wanted to do that. He wanted to give in a way that prioritized his giving, and he felt the sacrifice required to give back to God. Look, when you give like this, when you start with priorities and percentages, here's what God has shown Cinda and I. He can do more with 85 or 90% of my income than I can do with 100%. And that's not just math. That's a supernatural blessing that God arranges and God has brought into our lives as we've increased our generosity. I've seen it over and over again in my own life and in the lives of others. So when it comes to your income, think this. God can do more with less of my income than I can do with all of my income. And I want to say that again. God can do more with less of my income than I can do with all of my income. Here's what I've seen in my life and in the lives of others when giving gets priorities and percentages. I've seen more contentment. Could the pathway to contentment be through a generous life? People who live that way would say so. For the widow that day to give what she gave, she had to have this deep trust that God was going to provide. And we have to admit that in our abundance, it's harder and harder to trust in God as our provider because, frankly, we've got it taken care of. But it's not our prosperity that leads to contentment. It's our generosity towards God that will lead to contentment. Prioritized and percentage giving will bring more joy to my life. I've never met an unhappy, generous person. Why? Because the generous person enjoys increases they have because they know where they came from, and that's from God. And if you're struggling with contentment, satisfaction, and joy, the fastest way to get there is through your generosity. Any other way is going to be like driving without a map. You'll just be wandering around aimlessly. But when we think about Jesus' different way to think about generosity that's not about amounts, but it's about sacrifice and priorities and percentage giving, we will feel more direction in life than we ever have with our finances. Now, I want to read the episode at the temple that day again as we close. Mark 12, beginning at verse 41. Read along with me. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all that she had to live on." May this section of the book of Mark show us how giving, how generosity is different for those of us who follow Jesus. Now let's go do that.